Disposal Specialist here. This is Washington National Record Center. This is the Using WNRC Services seminar. Here's a few, on the second slide, in a nutshell, you'll see a few items that we're going to cover in the seminar today. We're going to talk about how to prepare and pack records for retirement. Retirement is just a fancy way of saying you're going to send them here. We're going to hold them and manage them for you until it's time to dispose of them. We're going to talk about the SF-135 and how to fill it out, where to get it. We're going to talk a little bit about the ARCIS customer portal, which more and more people are using, and which over time is going to become increasingly encouraged and eventually mandatory. Then we have the transfer custody of records to WNRC. That's really what the whole process is about, but I'm sure that bullet point's referring to the actual physical shipment of the records here after the approval process is complete. Then we're going to talk about reference, how to temporarily or permanently withdraw the materials that are already here. We're going to talk about recycling or accessioning records. They're not always recycled. Sometimes they are accessioned, as the note there alludes to. Sometimes they are burnt, depending on their sensitivity. And then finally, we're going to take a tour of the facility, and you'll get to see our beautiful football field-sized stacks. And unfortunately, the folks on the phone won't be joining us for that. Someday, maybe I'll have a GoPro, but I think we might run into security issues with that, so probably not, actually. Is there anything else that people in the room or over the phone line wanted covered today? I can make sure to address it over the course of the session. Any other concerns, questions, things you hope to learn about? Yes, ma'am.
Your second slide is not in the package. Would you be sending that to us later?
The second slide is not in the package?
Number 2. No.
Okay, I'd be happy to email you the entire presentation later. I'm sorry that they're not the same. Thought it was. No. Are there any other questions or concerns? Or things that you'd like to see covered today?
The majority of classes from AMS, and I'm the agency records officer, we do use their electronic system. So when he's talking about the SF-135 paper thing, we don't do that anymore. So.
There is a good deal of stuff you can learn from the SF-135 process, even if you're not going to use the form anymore, just because it's good to have a clear understanding of what the different terms on the form mean. So don't check out completely, even if you use ARCIS, because a lot of the fields on the SF-135 got mapped onto ARCIS, but it's still good to understand what they refer to.
Yeah, I recommend you use it to fill out your information, and then you can use that to go into the ARCIS system to fill out what you see there.
That's kind of like what my job used to be like when I was a processor of new SF-135s before ARCIS existed. So anyway, moving on to slide number 3. So what is a record? Do you guys have this slide?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Record, any documentary material regardless of physical form made or received by an agency. That's the statutory definition of a record. Most of the times when we talk about records here, we're talking about paper, but we also could be talking about a hard disk with electronic data. We could be talking about a canister full of film. We could be talking about photographs. We could be talking about architectural and engineering drawings. We have a fair amount of those here. But all of these are records, regardless of their format. Even the things in your email folder are records. Record group, records of a major government entity. That definition is incomplete. I would define a record group as a 3-digit billing code that corresponds to your agency. Some agencies have multiple record groups. Other agencies just have one. Probably the agency with the most record groups is the U.S. Navy. I think they have about 10. Most agencies just have one, and then if they need to differentiate different billing destinations, they do so using 2-letter or 2-number charge codes, which are kind of a sub-record group. But some agencies, especially the ones who set up their arrangements with us earlier in the previous century, have multiple record groups in order to disambiguate different billing accounts. Record schedule, mandatory instructions for maintaining and disposing records. A record schedule is a collection of agreements between the National Archives and various agencies. To my knowledge, every agency has one that stores their records anywhere in the Record Center program. And a record schedule is made up usually of a manual, which is a good faith attempt to predict all the different types of records that an agency would produce, and then many subsequent SF-115 forms which amend or add to the manual and create new types of records, new record series as we call them, new agreements about a specific type of records and how many years we're going to keep it. So a record schedule refers to all of that together for a particular record group, which, as I said earlier, usually corresponds with a particular agency. And finally, the disposal authority, the shorthand that identifies the schedule and the disposal authority. Yeah, so a disposal authority is a particular, it's the official name of the record series. And that's what we use to label transfers that will tell us later on how long we're going to keep it and whether we're eventually going to accession it to the National Archives Permanent Collection or just get rid of it. Does anybody have questions about any of these basic terms on page 3? Either over the phone or in person? Let's move on to page 4. So this is a very common example of a record series. We have GRS 1.1 financial management records. So that would contain a number of sub-items. So each of these sub-items is a record series, and together they make up a schedule. So the general record schedule is available for use by all agencies. It's the one that they have in common. And this is one of the most common, probably the most common record series, GRS 1.1 item 010 here. You can put a lot of different stuff under here. There used to be several GRS items that together were combined to make this one huge one. There are a number of other GRS schedules and series, of course, but this is the most common one.
4 pages, just so you know.
Yeah, I think they didn't do your back and front.
Oh, geez. Is that what they did?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I will fix that at the break. Until then, we'll just have to live with it. I'm very sorry about that. Okay. So moving on. Yeah, so this applies to routine financial transactions and contracts under a certain amount. Very common record series and a good example of what one is. Okay. Okay, so you can see here that the record schedule includes a record series, which is the type of records that as we discussed, so procurement files in this case. It includes a retention period, temporary 6 years for the first item there, and temporary destroy when business use ceases for the second item. And together, this makes up the DAU. So the DAU is over here, DAA GRS 2013 0003 0002. Or 0001 for the first item. And so that's what we would put in ARCIS for a particular transfer, one of those or the other. Not both, because every transfer can only have one DAU, with a handful of exceptions, but not many. Here's another example of a record schedule. This is somewhat an older one. This is a manual page, so you can see here that there's a overall records schedule number for the whole manual, and then there's a large number of items within the manual, and you can see that each of these items has a record series, for example, records maintained by the Office of Records Administration, and a retention period, in this case, temporary destroy after 5 years. So there's your schedule, there's your series, retention period is there, and this would be your DAU. So you can see here at the first part of the DAU is the same as the manual's record schedule number. Then the second part of the DAU is the item number, so 13011B. You got to have the item number in there because different items have different retention periods, and that's the most important part of a DAU is knowing the retention period. So without the item number, we'll have to guess. But really what we'll do is contact you to get the complete information. Here's another example of a record schedule. This is a more modern type, one that was generated within the last few years. I can see here it's 2011. So you can see here that this one as well contains all the essential elements. We have the record series, holdings protection. We have the retention period, cut off at the end of the fiscal year and then destroy 5 years after cutoff. Temporary, and then together they combine to make the DAU here. So you can see the schedule number 64-2011-1 and the item number 1. So this is important. Each transfer can contain only one series or disposal authority. Remember, the series is the verbal description of what the type of records is, and the disposal authority is the serial number which we assign to a particular item within a record schedule. So that's an important thing to note. A records transfer can have any number of boxes. It can cover any range of years, but it can only have one record series or disposal authority. They have to be the same type of records. Electronic media cannot be stored in permanent transfers. Permanent transfers have to be paper because we know how long paper lasts. Most electronic media are too new to know how long they last. Do they really last 80 years? We're not sure. So the permanent stuff is mostly paper. In fact, I think it's all paper, maybe a few photos. Make sure records are in usable order. You might need them later. Yeah, that's important. Even with temporary records that are probably going to mostly end up being destroyed, you might have to reference them. You know, and for that reason, you're going to want to have some kind of internal logic to them. In fact, even though we don't require a inventory list in advance for temporary transfers, we still recommend that you create one just to keep in your office, so that if you ever need to reference part of the transfer, you'll know which box to request, which folder to request within a box, and you won't have to pay extra fees to have people go hunting for a record that of which you don't know the exact location. So whenever you have a chance, you should use the standard FRC boxes. We're going to cover that in more depth a little bit later, but just in case I forget to mention it, the standard FRC box is available on the GSA Advantage website. It's called a special use box. You'll know you have the right one, both because you recognize the photo. I'm going to show you many standard boxes later during the tour, and I'm also going to bring one in and put it on camera later on in the presentation. But you'll know you have the right one because it specifically mentions the Federal Record Centers in the item description on the GSA Advantage website. Moving on to the next slide. How to pack a box. So there's a picture on the slide here, page 8, of a rather low-res picture, not the one I would have chosen, of a Federal Record Center box. So you can see here that there are two ways to use to orient the pages. You can either go front to back and do letter size, or you can go side to side and do legal size. And it fits perfectly in the box either way. That's why it's such a peculiar dimensions in order to accommodate letter or legal paper without having to fold or bend it. So there you can see an example of legal size documents in folders packed within the box, oriented side to side in the second photo there. So just treat it like a file drawer, because that's really what it is. You know, you're trying to free up space in your office. You don't want any more file drawers in your vicinity, so you pack up a file drawer into a box that's the size of a file drawer, and you send it to us. We put it on the shelf. Treat it as a remote file drawer. That's what we're selling you, after all, is space, expertise, and you know, remote filing. Use file folders where you can. It's much easier to keep things organized when they're in the folder instead of just being loose. Remove heavy metal like binder rings or clips. The little paper clips, they aren't so bad. Staples, doesn't really matter. What we're really trying to avoid is what some people call spider clips. People call them binder clips with the black plastic. That can cause problems later on in the disposal process, so we'd really prefer that you didn't use those, especially for temporary records, because that can cause problems with the pulping process that we use to recycle them. So please, no binder rings or clips. Do not overstuff the boxes. Yeah, don't worry about the weight. I mean, if you're putting mostly paper in there, I mean, the weight's going to be fine. It's only when you start putting in VHS tapes or film that the weight becomes a problem. And even then, you know, I mean, fill up the box half full. Some of them are heavy. That's just life. But yeah, you shouldn't fill up the box 90% or 100% full. You want to have a little bit of space to work with. And the reason for that is sometimes you'll withdraw something, a file, and then you'll have new material to add to that file. And sometimes you'll have new files that you want to add to a box. Now, obviously that varies. Some transfers are very low reference activity. You want to send them here and just forget about them. And you're probably not going to have to reference them again and not think about that transfer until it's time to dispose of it. And then other transfers, like for court cases or something else, have very high reference activity. Or, for example, records related to federal prisons. Every time those get withdrawn, more stuff gets added to the inmate's file, you know, a parole hearing or whatever it might be. So it varies a lot. If you have records that you think are going to have a lot of new material added later, you might want to only go 2/3 full. If you have records that you're almost certain will never be referenced, you could probably get away with filling up the box 90% full. But you don't want to do 100% in either case, because if someone does need to reference it, you want to be able to flip through the records with their fingers without having to unpack the entire box and put it back. So 80% full is pretty good. We have a question?
When you pack a box and you don't do it as full, and you mentioned something about adding to it.
That's right.
How do they add to the box if it's here? Do you have to get the box back and add to it?
Oh, yes. When I mentioned adding material to an existing transfer, I was referring to a scenario where you've temporarily withdrawn a box. Okay. And then you add more relevant material to a particular file or case and then send the box back. That happens a fair bit. Obviously, with some transfers, that's not going to happen, and if you're pretty confident that's the case, you can fill up your boxes a little bit more. Like I said, prisoner records and court records, I think, are the ones that fill up the most. Medical files tend to fill up. But then other things like employee files, travel files, you know, it happened, you know, and probably the new stuff is going to be in a new transfer. So. Does anybody have any questions about packing boxes, either in person or over the phone? No? Okay, moving on. Page 9 here, submitting transfer requests. Quick fact, there are 18 FRC facilities in 9 regions throughout the U.S. The more you know. I've only been to 2 or 3 myself. Submitting transfer requests.
Brian, I do apologize. Brian, I apologize.
I'm listening, Scott. Did the audio cut out again?
And the question's from Karen Heyman, and she's asked, do we have to remove prong fasteners as well as we're packing boxes?
Prong fasteners. I'm not sure if I'm familiar. If it's metal and it's...
They're like what's inside classification folders.
If it's metal and it's thicker than a paper clip, we'd appreciate it if you removed it, yes. Paper clips and staples are fine, but any metal that's thicker than that, like a binder ring, if it's like that thickness, we'd appreciate it if you removed it, if it's a temporary transfer.
I think the prong fasteners would be, you know, the classification folders where you open up the folder and it has multiple tabs, and it's up at the top, and it goes through 2 holes that are hole punched in the document?
That kind. Yeah, we use those for files here, like to extend a file folder, that kind.
That's the kind, yeah.
I think that's fine. I think those are thin enough, but you know, that it's not a problem. I haven't heard of that being a problem. It's that black plastic binder clips that we occasionally get a call from Philly that
right.
You know, it's caused a problem. Yeah, because those are pretty thin, even though they're kind of wide. So I think we'd probably rather not have them, but I think it's okay.
Karen, I've unmuted your phone. Did that answer your question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
I sure can.
Yes, you did answer my question. It's exactly that. They go to the top of our folder, and we clip all our papers with hole punch, and then we use the fasteners.
Yeah, those are pretty thin, so I don't think it's a problem. It's really those black plastic clips we're worried about.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Thank you.
Brian, I have a question.
We got one question here in the room. Yep.
For the box size, if you're transferring a box, I know you said it's preferred that you use the standard issue, but are you able to use other types of boxes?
If anybody didn't hear that, the question is, must we use the standard size box or can we use other box sizes? And the answer is you can use other box sizes. But when you create the transfer in ARCIS or when you send in an SF-135, if you could write the exact dimensions of the box you're going to use in the series description field on the SF-135 or in the comments field in ARCIS, or the series description field in ARCIS, that'd be fine too, because I know not everyone has access to the comments field. We need the exact dimensions because what we're going to do is figure out how many of that container we can fit on a shelf and bill you accordingly, right? So if you were using a box that's 3 inches wider than a standard size box, we're going to charge you for 2 spaces because we can't put another standard size box in the space next to it anymore. So that's the disadvantage of using unusual box sizes. But sometimes it is inevitable. The most common is maps and architectural drawings. We get a fair number of those from the Navy and the Air Force, among other sources. And they come in a tube that's like 3 or 4 feet long with a diameter of 6 to 8 inches. And we have billing for that, and we know how many of those we can fit on a shelf, and we have special billing for that, and we just appreciate if the exact dimensions are on the transfer.
So is the billing, does that go to the green book or to your, or is that submitted from your actual space? I mean, from your actual agency?
Yeah, each agency has a separate account with us. In fact, most agencies have several, and some have dozens or hundreds. And each of those is tied to a different bank account, and the billing, I believe, is automatic at the end of every month.
You guys, for AMS people, you guys do that, right?
The billing is tied to your record group, and then many people have a specific billing subgroup within their record group. Does anybody have any other questions? Okay, so moving on to the processing process, a bit repetitive there on page 10. We can see here the life cycle of a transfer of government records within the Record Center program, from being submitted either in ARCIS or via an SF-135 that's emailed or faxed to us, processed by us, reviewed by us, but by the superior of the person processing usually, security reviewed by me or my colleague Brenda or Tasha, then approved for transfer. That's part of the security review process. So now it's approved, and that's when the first billing takes place. Then return to the agency. You receive the SF-135 back, or you can check in your customer portal in ARCIS, where it's revealed this transfers X, Y, and Z are approved. Transfers A, B, and C are still unsubmitted. Then finally, you actually send it to us. So that's the processing process, the kind of beginning of the life cycle of a record within our facility. And we're going to go through this in detail, so if there's anything you're particularly curious about, don't worry, we're going to get to it. Submitting transfer requests. So that was the first part of that process, was submission. And there's a few different ways to do that. An increasingly common method is the ARCIS customer portal, and like I said, eventually that will be mandatory. Before, you could do it either way. Now, you can still do it either way, but there's a special surcharge if you don't use ARCIS, and in the future, you must use ARCIS. So if your agency...
approximately when in the future it will be mandatory?
Yeah, Ebony, do we have an exact date for that? I think it's about a year from now, maybe like the beginning of fiscal year 2020. So that would be October 2019. I think it'll be mandatory by then, and I think the fee is going to go up, next year.
For AMS, we are in that. We're not doing paper anymore.
Yeah. I think the fee goes up one more time, and then it's going to be mandatory the year after that. Scott, do you know that? Do you know when ARCIS is going to be mandatory, when they're going to get rid of other forms of submitting records?
I don't know that we've clearly defined that yet, as we're working with all the different agencies to help them in the transition over to the new process. So I don't know that we've clearly defined it yet.
I see. So maybe we've just talked about it. We don't have an exact date. Well, I'm sorry for the misinformation.
Yeah,
but it would be fair to say that Argus Customer Portal is strongly encouraged, correct?
It absolutely is, not just because of the more convenient factor. It's tremendously more secure when an agency is fully deployed. Tremendously more secure.
And in the meantime, you'll save a little bit of money by avoiding that surcharge that we've put in place. So anyway, the other way to send things in besides the customer portal is sending a paper SF-135. It doesn't actually have to be paper. You can download the editable PDF from our website at archives.gov/FRC/forms. You can get a PDF version of the SF-135 form that is editable. That might be useful even for the people using the portal if you're one of the people who likes to use an SF-135 as a template before entering stuff into the customer portal. So you can either print it off and write on it, or just edit the PDF and save it, and then email it to suitland.transfer@nara.gov. That goes over to room 125, where there's several people who have access to that group account. I used to be the one to check it for 2 different periods of time. Ebony, do you check it now? So Ebony Tate, who's here in the room, is the current custodian of that group account primarily. But there's a number of people who have access to it. So if Ebony called in sick or she was on vacation or some such thing, probably I would check the account and print off any 135s that came into there. The other way you can do it is mailing it to 4205 Suitland Road, Suitland, Maryland 20746. Then the final way would be to fax it. It goes to the fax machine right across the hall. Believe it or not, that still happens, once or twice a week. Get a SF-135 by fax. So we still get a fair amount by email, probably 20 or 25 a day. At least that's how it was a few months ago when I was doing it. But the majority come through the portal now. Now, all transfers are going to be entered into Argus. The only difference is if you use the customer portal, you enter probably 3/4 of the information, and then our processors double check to make sure it's coherent, and add a little bit that for fields that you guys don't have. Whereas in the other case, when you send in an SF-135, we enter everything into Argus. Someone processes that SF-135 by entering the information contained on it into Argus. And that is a little more work for us, and that's why we've begun charging that surcharge for non-portal transfers. Does anybody have any questions about how to submit transfer requests? Oh, okay. What's the question?
I know you have a video online, but I have a patient out in California, Oklahoma, with poor network connection.
Yep.
So they can't take the training. Is there a hard copy available that they can use?
That's a good question for Scott. Scott, if someone has a poor network connection and they have a hard time viewing the online training videos for Argus, can they get like a DVD or some such thing sent to them? Does that exist?
Well, Brian, that is a very good question. I don't know if we have that. I'm not saying we don't. I'm saying I actually don't know if we have it, but I will look into that for you. Let's see. I'll see if I can get an answer before the seminar is over. But if you could send me a message via email, I'm scott.thompson@nara.gov, or you could reach out to Brian or somehow so that we can find you again. I'll look into it and see if there's a way we can get a copy of that for you.
Thank you.
No problem. Does anybody else have any?
Brian, one more question, if you could. We're having a little bit of a difficulty hearing the audience ask the questions. Could you repeat their question before you answer?
Oh, I sure will. From now on, I will. That last question was about potentially getting a physical copy of the Argus training video for an employee in the regions with a poor network connection. And the answer was we're not sure, but we'll try to find out. Does anybody else have any questions here in the room or over the phone line about submitting transfer requests or about another subject? Let's move on to the next slide. Oh, Okay, so if you look on the left side of your folder, or in the attachments you were sent via email if you're listening over the phone line, you will find a blank SF-135 form. That one's not an even page from the PowerPoint presentation, so I know it's in there. If anybody doesn't have one, let me know and I can make a copy of someone else's.
In the back.
I think for most people it's going to be, yeah, near the back. Okay. So if everybody is looking at a blank SF-135, if you didn't get that attachment for the people listening over the line, you can find, again, that editable PDF form on archives.gov/FRC/forms and follow along with that. So this is just a good thing to keep out and reference as we go through each of these various fields and talk about what they represent and how to fill them out properly. And as I mentioned earlier, even if you use the customer portal, this can be a useful exercise because it will help you more precisely define these terms and what they mean and what an appropriate response is to the questions implicit within the forms here. So here we go. So this slide here, page 13, takes a pretty close look at the top left portion of the SF-135 form. So you can see here, field 1 is the address of the record center. So this is 4205 Suitland Road, Suitland, Maryland 20746. But as the previous slide briefly mentioned, there are many other centers. There's, one in North Philly I've been to. There's a couple in Chicago. There's like 3 in St. Louis area. There's Seattle. Scott is in Riverside, California. There's Atlanta. There's a bunch. 2 in Massachusetts. So whichever record center you want to send it to, we're the only one that takes classified information. Many of the others are, for a particular agency, for the most part, IRS often. But others have a broad range of records that they accept and take on a regular basis. The only difference is that we're the only one that takes classified now. There used to be a couple others, but not anymore. So that's field 1, the address of where it's going. Field 2, agency transfer authorization, and field 3, agency contact. Now, what does this mean? What's the difference between these? Oftentimes, people don't understand what the difference is, and for a smaller office, it might actually be the same person who's in field 2 and field 3. What I usually tell people is that field 3 is the person who physically filled out the SF-135 form or physically entered a transfer into the ARCIS customer portal, and field 2 is that person's supervisor. Now, in a small records office, it might well be that someone in a supervisory position is personally filling out SF-135 forms, and in that case, it would be the same person. So does that make sense for everybody?
For AMS, I'm number 2, and you're number 3.
That's how it would work, yeah. So that's how we usually disambiguate those terms. Then field 4, you leave blank. That's for us. It used to be that the director would actually sign all of them, like with a pen. Now we have a stamp. But that we eventually will put a stamp in the field 4 once it is on the shelf. Does anybody else have any questions about this portion of the SF-135 form or about these concepts vis-a-vis the ARCIS customer portal? Okay, moving on to page 14. Files custodian, records officer, P&D branch chief, that's our branch. Yeah, include the contact information, that's important. You want to have the phone number and preferably the email address in field 2 and field 3 if you can. Okay, now you'll see the top right quadrant of the SF-135 form is just one big field, field 5. Now field 5 is where you put your address. The other thing that goes in field 5 is if you use a customer reference number, I recommend that you put that under the address in field 5. Now if you don't know what a customer reference number is, don't worry, I'm going to address that shortly, but for now, just understand this is where it goes, under the address in field 5. And when I say address, I'm talking about a snail mail physical address. If you don't use it for anything else, you still use it for shipping boxes. So that's what it's about. Then you can see the customer reference number. We recommend that location for it. Okay, moving on to a big one. This is biggie. We're looking at field 6. It's divided into 5 smaller subparts, A, B, C, D, and E. Now, 6A, B, and C together make up what we call the transfer number. The SF-135 form will say accession number. That's the old language, but we say transfer number now. So 6A is your record group. I mentioned that earlier. Record group is a 3-digit code that corresponds to your agency that we use for billing purposes. Does anybody here know what their record group is?
For AMS, it's 136.
136 for AMS. 568, that's another good one. Can I help you? 514. So a few people here know what their record group is. Hopefully, if you're listening in, you know what yours is too. If you don't, as an important piece of information, you can ask me or Scott, and if we don't know it off the top of our head, we'll be happy to look it up for you. That's something that's going to come up every time you interact with us, so it's an important thing to know. So that's the record group, field 6A. 6B is the current fiscal year, expressed as 2 digits, usually. Well, no, 4 these days. It's 2 digits on here because it's the old style, but usually now it's 4, 2017. But you can put 2 if you want. I mean, we'll know what to do. We'll enter it into ARCIS as 4. Then finally, 6C, that is a 4-digit number that's unique to that particular transfer, and that's assigned by ARCIS now. But here it says CRN because when you're filling it out, this is another place where you can put the CRN if you want. I prefer that you put it in field 5, but many people put it here, and that's acceptable as well. What will happen is we'll write CRN over to the left, and then we'll write the new transfer number underneath that. So I guess this is as good a time as any to talk about customer reference numbers and what they are. In the past, before 2009 and the arrival of ARCIS, we assigned numbers, transfer numbers, to each transfer here at the record center, but that created problems down the line, because since there were 18 record centers, there might be many transfers that had the same number and were only differentiated by the letter in front, and that can cause confusion because that letter is not physically on the box. So when smaller record centers closed, like we used to have one in Bayonne, New Jersey that closed, we used to have one in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania that closed, and there are a few others that I'm sure I'm forgetting. There's also instances where large amounts of records are transshipped to a different center. When that happened, it would cause confusion because we might end up with several transfers in the same center with the same number. We didn't want to have misfiles from that, and so what part of ARCIS being launched was the transfer numbers were now assigned by a machine nationally, so that if there's a transfer that's numbered PT 463 2017 0056, it's the only one with that number. Now, you can see the upside there. You prevent confusion in the future, but there's also a downside, namely that for a certain period of time between the transfer being submitted to us, either as a paper 135 and or via email, not by the ARCIS portal, but via email, and us processing it in ARCIS and then sending it back to the customer, there was that period where it didn't really have a name. It was kind of difficult to refer to it. You know, you'd have to call up and say, well, I sent you one last week. It had 10 boxes. It was procurement files. It was from the Hawaii office. And we'd have to kind of go hunting for it. And so the customer reference number appeared as kind of a temporary name that customers would assign to the transfer when they sent in the SF-135. We would enter it in ARCIS in a separate field from the transfer number, and that way if the customer had to call or we had to call the customer to ask about a transfer, we would be able to refer to it before it had been approved. So that's what the customer reference number is and how it came into being. Most people do kind of a makeshift transfer number as their CRN. They'll put, like, let's say your record group is 064, which is our record group. They would put 064-17-0001, and the next one's 0002, the next one's 003. Yes, sir.
So CRN, obviously that's something that's created by the individual who's making the SF-135
Yeah.
transfer. So is there any check on NARA's side that that customer reference number hasn't already been created before?
It might be. You know, but since it's not the official name of the transfer, that's not as big of a deal.
Okay.
But it is possible to have repeat customer reference numbers. For instance, if an agency has multiple field offices, for the people listening over the phone, the question was, is there any mechanism to ensure that customer reference numbers aren't used more than once? And the answer is there's not. There might be several transfers with the same customer reference number, especially in situations where an agency has numerous field offices. You know, what I would recommend is if you are in that position where your agency has numerous offices that are sending in 135s to the same record center, I would make your customer reference number something different than just a makeshift transfer number with, you know, 064-17-0001-002, next one's 003. I would do something like procurement files 1, procurement files 2, contracts 1, contracts 2, travel 1, travel 2. Kind of what kind of records it is. Or you could do the name of the office. You could do Richmond 1, Richmond 2, Savannah 1, Savannah 2, and so on. You can do anything you want for a customer reference number, just as long as it's, you know, short enough. I'd make it like, you know, less than 20 digits if you could.
In the ARCA system, it generates it by itself, right?
No, the question is, does ARCUS auto-generate customer reference numbers? And the answer is no, it does not. You put one in if you want one in ARCUS, but if you're using the ARCUS customer portal, what it gives you is the actual PT number right away. So the customer reference number is of the most use to those customers who are still using the older methods of submitting SF-135s, either via email or mailing them in. If you're using the ARCUS customer portal, you don't have to use customer reference numbers if you don't want to, because it gives you the real PT number as soon as you create it. Does anybody else have any questions about them? CRNs? Okay, so moving on, fields 6D and 6E are the volume and the agency box numbers. So you can see here the only difference is the way it's expressed. The volume is 50, whereas the agency box numbers are 1 through 50. And the reason that they're usually the same is because a standard FRC box is exactly 1 cubic foot. So if you're using standard boxes, the agency box numbers and the volume in cubic feet are going to be the same value. They're just going to be expressed differently. Box numbers 1 through 50, volume in cubic feet is 50. Now, there are some cases where a transfer is eventually split up. That usually would be something that we do later at the disposal stage and not something that you do when you send it in. Now, in those cases, you might end up with a situation where the volume is 50 and the box numbers are 51 through 100 or 37 to 86, you know. So that is a situation where they differ, but when you're sending in a fresh new transfer, they're usually going to be the same. Now, if you're using a non-standard size box, the volume might be different, but you don't need to laboriously calculate the exact volume. What you might want to do instead is use that opportunity to put the dimensions of the boxes you're using in 6D. The other place you could put the dimensions of the boxes you're using is in field 5 beneath the address, the same place I recommended you put the customer reference number. Oh, and I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but like here you can see the customer reference number is listed in 6C. It would really be 6A, B, and C, so 00017, and then let's say that's 0001. That would be a customer reference number. A lot of people do put it there, but I recommend that you leave 6C blank and just put the customer reference number in field 5. 6A and 6B you can fill in if you want, because we know what they're going to be. You know what your record group is, or at least you should. And the fiscal year is just the current fiscal year. And then ARCUS will assign the last 4 digits. Now, there is one edge case that people often ask about. They ask, what if I send you an SF-135 on September 30th? You know, you might not process it until October 1st. So what about that? And the answer is that in that case, if you send me an SF-135 via email on September 30th that has a 17 in field 6B, I'll cross it out and write 18 on October 1st when I process it. If you're doing it via the customer portal, since it assigns the number automatically, it'll give you a 17 up until midnight on September 30th. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. So, moving on. Series description field 6F. This is one that a lot of people have a hard time with. Note what it says right up there under series description. With inclusive dates of records. Very important. We need that, especially the end date, because that's what we use to calculate the retention period and the disposal date for a given transfer. So what goes in 6F? Well, the first thing that goes in there is the series description, right? Now, you might remember the record series is part of the record schedule. It's a particular item within it, and it's a type of records that your agency and our agency have an agreement regarding. So a common example, and one that we saw earlier, is routine procurement files, right? Procurement files under $3,000. That's another example. Completed employee travel documents. That is a series description. Records of the Undersecretary of Defense. That is a series description. There's a number of different series descriptions. The closer you are to the word-for-word series description listed in the record schedule, the easier it's going to go. If we see something in here that is radically different than the series description associated with the DAU you cite in the next field, we'll call you about it. We might not send that one forward right away. So it's for the best if rather than trying to wing it, you decide what DAU you're going to use and include that series description in here. The other thing that goes in here is the inclusive dates of the records. Now that's the date the records were made. Not necessarily the date you're looking at them or the date that you're sending it in. So for instance, if I were compiling the, let's say I was compiling White House press briefings of the Clinton administration, right? Then the inclusive dates of those records would be January 20th, 1993 to January 19th, 2000, or 2001 rather. And that would be the inclusive dates of the records, even if I was looking at them in 2017, because I know that all those press briefings actually took place between 1993 and 2001. So that's what inclusive dates of records means, and that end date is the more important of the two, because that's what we use to calculate disposal dates, something that we're going to cover exhaustively together later on in the class. 6F is also another location, like Field 5, where you can put the dimensions of your non-standard box if you're using non-standard boxes. It should go without saying that if you're using standard FRC boxes, there's no need to include the dimensions. Does anybody have any questions about Field 6F? Either in person or over the phone? Okay, in that case, I'm going to move on. Title of the series, description of the records, inclusive dates of records. Oh yeah, this is another thing to put in Field 6F, is if you use a separate billing code. I mentioned a couple times earlier that some record groups are subdivided into particular billing codes. Many agencies only have one. They just have 00 and the whole agency gets billed to the same account. Many agencies have literally 100 of these things. So if you use a particular billing code and not the general 00 billing code for your agency, this is a good spot to put it. You can put it in Field 5 too if you want under the address. That's another thing that can go at either place, like the dimensions. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about Field 6F before I move on?
Definition of restrictions, please.
Oh, okay. We're talking about Field 6G now, I suppose. This means classification or Privacy Act. Those are the two types of restrictions that this would be alluding to. There's also some other statuses that are considered a restriction, such as sensitive but unclassified. But the big ones are if someone has, if something has been formally national security classified, this is the place to put the level of classification. If something falls under the Privacy Act of 1974, you put a P for privacy. Some people put a W. That was the old code for that. I don't know why. Privacy Act, I suppose. But we accept that, but we prefer the P. What is the Privacy Act of 1974? It's a law that's pretty relevant to records management, so it would be worth looking into if this is your field. It covers a large number of records containing personally identifiable information, particularly personally identifiable information that could be damaging. For instance, financial records, especially records related to debt or bankruptcy, criminal records, that aren't public, negative employment proceedings, if someone is under administrative review or if someone is, say, dishonorably discharged. Some of that information of a negative nature is public, but there's other information of that nature that is not. For employee travel documents, the credit card number of that employee's travel card is PII and is covered by the Privacy Act. It's worth familiarizing yourself with it. It's worth looking into. And then there's other things like, of course, court proceedings are public. I can look them up. I can go to the registrar's office in my county and find out who owns a particular piece of land. But then there's other types of records that are covered by the Privacy Act. Notably, federal employees carrying out their normal duties is not covered by the Privacy Act. So if I am just here doing my job and my name comes up because, and it's not a negative employment proceeding, it's not a credit card number or something, just the fact that it has a name on it does not make it PII. It has to be damaging, either because it would hurt your reputation or because someone could access your finances. Tax information is another big one. Pretty much everything the IRS sends us is covered under PII, and other laws in their case. So I'm sure this is going to fill out a little bit more. This is very important. The restriction field, 6G on the SS-135, or the corresponding field in the ARCIS customer portal cannot be blank. We won't accept it. And with most of these other fields, if you make a mistake or if you forget to fill it out, we'll just call you. You don't have to go back to square one. We'll call you on the telephone or pop you an email. You can tell us what you meant to put, and we'll fix it. This is the exception. If this is blank, we will throw it out, and you'll have to start over from step one. Because we've had problems in the past, and so if we get one with a blank restriction field, it's no good. So this is another important point. A lot of people put sometimes a whole sentence in field 6F, or sometimes they'll put like a confusing letter, like R for restricted, in field 6G. And what they'll mean by that is that they don't want the public to be able to come in and just read these records at will, like they're, at the city library, But what you got to understand is that all the records here already are protected to that degree. Someone from the public can't come in off the street and just look at what we have on the stacks here. Doesn't happen. The stuff in here is under our physical custody, but it's still under your legal custody, and people can only access it with your permission. Even if they have a FOIA request, they would have to send that FOIA request to you. You would respond to the FOIA request, and part of that response might be you contacting us to either temporarily withdraw some transfers so that you could distribute them as you see fit, or to add this person who submitted the request to you, the people who are authorized to view the records in the reading room here. There's a few different ways to go about it, but no one from the public is going to view your records without your permission. So there's no need to create a special status or to ask for that. That's the default state at a federal records center, as opposed to, for instance, the National Archives in College Park, where many people are academic researchers, people who are writing a book, who can go in there and view the records without the creating agency's permission, because those are owned by NARA now. They're owned by the American people, but they're administered by NARA. The stuff here is still administered by the creating agency and is only viewed with their permission. So national security classified. There's confidential, secret, top secret, and then there's formerly restricted data and restricted data. That's Department of Energy nuclear stuff. The Department of Energy also has their own version of C&S and TS. I think it's L and Q. I think L is like C&S and Q is like TS. So any of those are fine if they're appropriate. If you're not Department of Energy, don't use Q. Yeah, if the thing is actually classified to that level, you can put that in field 6G. That's going to result in them being stored in our vault at a higher rate. Another thing you can put in field 6G is the P. That's if they are unclassified, but they fall under the Privacy Act of 1974. If something is classified and it also falls under the Privacy Act of 1974, what you can do is put the classification in field 6G, and then in field 6F, just write a small phrase, records fall under the Privacy Act. Records are covered by the Privacy Act of 1974. Another thing you can put in here in field 6G is A. A. This is when records are not national security classified, but you would like them to be treated as such. You would like the full additional security measures which come with vault storage, classified shipping and handling, and so on. Now that ain't cheap. You're looking at paying 3 times as much for the storage and for the shipping and handling. But sometimes it's necessary. The most common use of A is by law enforcement agencies. If they have sensitive information that does not pertain to national security because it pertains to matters in the United States exclusively. So the witness protection program, things like that. That's the most common type of records that are A. Sealed grand jury testimony is A. But there are other agencies which occasionally use A because they have a records transfer which contains particularly sensitive materials. But you just got to understand to use it sparingly, if at all, because it costs 3 times as much. I don't know, you could figure out exactly how much it costs by looking at the unit rate inside the packet. Inside the packet that you were handed, and you can see the difference between the classified and the standard rates there on the left side.
Brian, we have a question from online.
Sure.
And it's from Victor Wager from the Federal Highway, I should stop trying to do 2 things at once. Federal Highway Administration. Victor has a question here. It says, note that controlled unclassified information is replacing the terms SBU, FOUO, etc. Has FRC seen that listed yet?
Actually, I've never seen that on a transfer. Have any of you seen that yet? Yeah, I've seen the others. I've seen SBU and I've seen for official use only, but I haven't seen this new one. What is it again, Scott? Could you repeat?
Yes, CUI, Controlled Unclassified Information.
CUI, okay. I've mainly seen SBU in the past, but it's been a while since I was processing new stuff.
I'm going to go ahead and unmute Victor and see if he can give further guidance here. Victor, can you hear us? Victor's audio isn't working, but the controlled unclassified info.
You know what? Now that I think about it a minute, I have seen that, but I've seen it as like CUI/SBU.
There we go.
That's how it's often expressed. Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, sensitive but unclassified, or controlled unclassified information, or the old way of saying it was for official use only. These are the kind of terms that I was referring to earlier when I talked about how our default level of protection is higher than people might expect. So you're welcome to put those things in field 6F if you want to. We're not going to send your 135 back or something because you use those terms. But that doesn't get you any special treatment here because the default level of security is already at that level here. So that's what I was referring to earlier. So all the records here are treated as if they were CUI. there's not a special place in our building where we put CUI. There's not special handling that we use for CUI beyond normal Privacy Act materials. Please put it on there if you want, and we'll treat them as Privacy Act at like the disposal phase. But during the time period that they're here in the building, they're going to be in the general stacks because none of it is publicly accessible. It's all behind a locked double door, as you'll see later on. But yeah, many people use those phrases, and that corresponds to the default level of security at our building. So anyway, a higher level of security is available. You just have to put an A, but it costs more. Then finally, business confidential, SBU. That's another thing you can put in 6G. As we were just talking about, CUI is the current use. We treat that kind of like Privacy Act, where it goes in the same places in the building as the regular unclassified stuff, but we're more careful of it at disposal, because once something's being disposed, obviously it leaves the building. So there's a little more care taken, security there. Finally, vital records. I'm not sure if there's an abbreviation for that in 6G. Do you know that, Ebony? Is there an abbreviation for vital records in 6G?
No.
I think that those people would just put, N, and then just mention that they're vital records in the series description. It's a drop-down in ARCIS. Okay. Yeah. So if they're vital records, there's a drop-down for that in ARCIS, but if you were filling out an SF-135 to email in, I would just put N, and then, or NA in the 6G field, and then just write in 6F that they're vital records. So NA is the preferred term, as you can see at the top of the list here, for unclassified records that do not fall under the Privacy Act and are not CUI SBU. So, like I said, it can't be blank. So if it doesn't fall into any of these special categories, just put NA. Some people put N. We accept that. Some people put U for unclassified. We accept that. But these days, the preferred is NA, as you can see at the top over here. So does anybody have any questions about restriction codes? All right, moving on. Next up, field 6H, the DAU, also known as the disposition citation. So this is the schedule notation that authorizes retention and disposition. Usually the SF-115 number or the agency manual, and it can change as the schedules are updated. So you have some examples of DAUs over here. These are different types. So you can see the top one here is a GRS, big bucket schedule. We actually looked at that exact one earlier in the class. Next up is an ERA generated DAU that corresponds to that GRS record schedule and item number. It's just a different way of expressing it. That's accessible too. Then below that, you have what we call an SF-115 number. That is a particular agreement, one particular one, that happened between our two agencies. You can see out there that the record schedules are filled with these things. So that's one in particular. Remember to include the item number. If the SF-115 number and the item number, we need both. Then N1649323A, that is another way of expressing that same number. So these two are actually the same. It's just a different way of expressing it. They're both valid. Here the item number is 3A. Here it says item 3A. Both are acceptable. And then finally at the bottom, that's what I would call a manual number. That's also a DAU, but it comes out of a records manual. As I mentioned, a typical record schedule will be a manual and then a number of SF-115s. So here's a manual. This is from an SF-115. So all of these are valid. There's different ways of expressing it. Sometimes they're different because they were created in different formats as the decades roll by. And sometimes it's just a personal choice how you choose to express the same information. But all of those are valid. The important thing to note is that you have the disposal, you have the record schedule, and then the record series, including the item number. We need the particular item because we have to get the particular disposal period, particular retention period right. Sorry, does anybody have any questions about writing DAU? And remember that each transfer only has one DAU. A transfer can have 1,000 boxes, if you really have that many. A transfer can cover 60 years, although that's not always wise because you end up holding on to some of the records much longer than you need to and paying more than you need to for storage fees. But a transfer can only have one DAU. Does anybody have any questions about that? We're going to take a look at some examples of record schedules as we go through the class.
I do have one question. You said you're only allowed to have one DAU
Per transfer. Yep.
Does that actually mean you can't have more than one DAU on each form? You can't have two DAUs on a form.
So the question is, considering that you can only have one DAU per transfer, are you allowed to have more than one DAU per form? And the answer is you're only supposed to use one form is supposed to have one transfer on it. Yeah, so each form should only have one DAU because each form should only have one transfer and each transfer should only have one DAU. Does anybody else have any questions? Now, that said, what some people do that's a mistake is they will, if they need more than one, if they want to have a box list for a permanent transfer or just because they want to include one, they'll use the SF-135 as a kind of template and just write in field 6F and include like 6 SF-135s, which are mostly blank, and just have box lists in field 6F. You don't need to do that. If you do a box list, you can do just a blank page and just fill up the whole page with box list info and then attach it to one SF-135 form. But yeah, one form per transfer, please. Does anybody have any questions about DAUs other than that? Okay, moving on to the disposal date. If you don't get this right away, that's cool, because we're going to do a whole exercise later, and we're going to go through a whole bunch of them, and I'm pretty sure you're going to get it by then. Dispositions are done in cycles. Permanent records are only done once a year. Temporary records are done every quarter, so January, April, July, and October. And the way you get a disposal date, shorthand, is to, as we talked about, the record series will contain a retention period. It'll say something like retain for 5 years, then destroy. That's a retention period. Then you recall that in field 6F, you have to include the inclusive dates of the records. So we take the end date from that inclusive date, right? So let's say it's today's date, right? July 12, 2017. Then I add the retention period, right? So 5 years in that case would make July 12th, 2022, right? And then I go to the beginning of the next quarter, because they're temporary records, destroy after 5 years, and that gives me a disposal date of October 1st, 2022. So if I had some records that were ending today that had the temporary 5 years disposal period that I just mentioned, that would be the disposal date, October 1st, 2022. So that's what you would put here in field 6I, disposal date. Now, most people don't actually put a T if it's temporary. They just put the date. But we do prefer if you put the P in front of a permanent date. And I'll tell you the reason for that. The reason is that there could be a temporary transfer whose disposal date was January 1st. However, if you give me one that's like April 1st, you know, the temporary is implied. You know what I mean? So if it's permanent, just say permanent. And then if you just have the date, we'll assume that's temporary. Some people put a P. Some people write perm and then hit return and then put in the date beneath the word perm. That's acceptable too. Usually you can't fit permanent in there, but if you can, that's acceptable too. Most people just put perm. And then moving on. Does anybody have any questions about disposal dates? We're still going to cover them a lot, so you might get it answered in the succeeding slides here. So here we go. Credit card purchase receipts, FY 2012. So what we have there is the record series and the inclusive dates, right? Here we have the retention period. Temporary 6-year retention. End date of the records is 9/30/2012. How do we find that out? Because we know the inclusive dates are fiscal year 2012. So what's the last day of fiscal year 2012? It's 9/30/2012. So then what you do is you add 6 years to that. You get 9/30/2018. That is the date of eligibility for disposal, but what do you know? It doesn't happen every day. It happens every quarter. So you go to the beginning of the next quarter, and that means it's going to be October 1st, 2018. So that's an example of how to calculate a disposal date. Does anybody have any questions about that particular one? We're going to go through a bunch of others. Yes, ma'am.
Can you repeat that for me again? I just calculated.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. Let's go back. So the question was just to repeat this slide again, to go through the process one more time. You're going to get plenty of them, but we'll go ahead and do this one again. We're going to do an exercise later where we do about 10 of these. So disposal date practice number 1. So what do you have here? Credit card purchase receipts, fiscal year 2012. That is the records series and the inclusive dates. So we've seen that elsewhere on the form. More info. From the record series, if we're looking at the DAU, we can acquire the retention period, right? Temporary, 6 years. Now we have all the information we need to calculate the disposal date. So what do? You look at the inclusive date, FY 2012. What's the end date? It's the last day of that period. So we know that that's going to be September 30th, 2012. Then you add the retention period, 6 years, right? So that gives you 9/30/2018, right? Now they're temporary, so that means that disposal happens every quarter. So you go to the beginning of the next quarter, which is October 1st, 2018. So that's the disposal date. Here's another one. Program policy records, fiscal year 2015. We're on slide 21 for those of you following along at home. Permanent this time, 15-year retention. End date of records, 9/30/2015. So what are we going to do? How do we get 9/30/2015? We got it because that's the last day of fiscal year 2015, right? So what are we going to do with that? We're going to add 15 years to it first. So that gives you 9/30/2030, right? But, like we talked about, disposal doesn't happen every day. It happens in bigger periods than that, right? Now, temporary, like in the previous example, disposal happens every quarter. But the permanent, quote, disposal, end quote, sending them to NARA, accessioning as we call it, only happens every January, once a year. So when you're doing permanent records, you add the retention period to the end date, 9/30/2030 in this case. Then you go to get to the next January 1st, right? So that would be January 1st, 2031. And that is the disposal date for that particular transfer. Anybody have any questions about that? Moving on. Box list / manifest / inventory. So we're through the SF-135 at this point. We got through all the fields. Does anybody have any questions about any of the fields of the SF-135 before we move on? Anything I didn't cover on the forum? Any questions you have about terminology? I know it can get kind of confusing for me too. All right. Any questions over the phone line before I move on? We're done with the SF-135 portion.
Brian, we do have a question from Melody Edwards.
Okay.
Melody, I'm going to unmute your phone line here, so you're going to ask your question direct to Brian. Melody, can you hear us?
Hello?
No, I guess we're still having some audio difficulties there. But it looks like it was related to the calculation of the disposition date because it was by fiscal year.
Yeah, oftentimes with permanent records, the end date will be the end of the fiscal year, but because we do the permanent accessioning at the beginning of the calendar year, that's the break, that's the period is, calendar years. There's often that mismatch, but it's not a big deal. All it means is you go to the next January when you're calculating the date. We're going to do a bunch of them later on. We're going to have an exercise sheet that has about 10, including a couple permanent ones. So we're going to cover that process again. Plus, as long as you write permanent, as long as you're citing a permanent DAU and you write permanent somewhere on the SF-135, preferably, with the disposal date, we're going to recalculate that date. We're going to double check it. So I hope that answers the question.
It did. Melanie says thank you.
No problem. My pleasure. Let's move on to box lists, manifests, and inventories. A lot of different names for the same thing. What is it? It's just a paper, usually, list of what's in the folders in each box. We talk about a folder level box list. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's .file level, right? That's not the most granular you could be. It's a level above that, So the most common thing is, let's say that my transfer is medical records from a military hospital, right? Then on the inventory list, I don't need to have the patient's names, right? I would have folders that were either a certain date, maybe a certain department, a certain room in the hospital, maybe they're a certain doctor, or if a patient has a big file, maybe it is the patient's name, but what I don't have is each individual file. Okay, this one contains x-ray of his broken ankle, x-ray of his emphysema, and a report from his group therapy session, right? I don't need the most granular information possible. I need a level above that. That's what a folder level box list is. Another common one would be, let's say the transfer is receipts for people who are using their expense account while traveling, right? The folders might be January, February, March, April. The folders might be Houston conference, Atlanta conference, lunch with clients in DC. But I don't need to have every single receipt listed on the inventory list. That's what's meant by a folder level box list. So they're required for permanent and unscheduled records. The reason they're required for unscheduled is because those unscheduled records might end up being permanent. Unscheduled is a volatile state, and those transfers will usually end up being permanent or temporary contingent or some other status. So we require box lists for permanent and unscheduled records. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, in the past, a lot of people would just use the blank SF-135 as kind of a form letter, and would just include as many of them as they needed to and just cram the box list into field 6F. It wastes a lot of paper. So what you do is just send in the one SF-135 as the front page, right, with a brief series description in field 6F, and then the box list is a separate Word document or a word processing document, right? You can go ahead and use the whole page, have it with bullet points, whatever format you want, it's all good. But you can just include it as a separate document. If you're doing it electronically, you can attach a box list in ARCIS. There's an attachments tab. So if you are creating a permanent or unscheduled transfer in the ARCIS customer portal, you can attach a box list. In fact, you must do so. If you don't, we will contact you. If you are creating a classified transfer in the ARCIS portal, you cannot attach anything to a classified transfer in ARCIS. What you have to do in that case is email it to one of us. To me, or to the Suitland.transfer group account, or to Ebony, or to Brenda, my colleague. Any of us would be fine. So that's how it's done. So list each box and the title of each folder. Note the beginning and end dates of records. Note any mixed media materials. Yeah. So these are all important things for different reasons. We need the title of each folder because when you do a request to temporarily withdraw some files, you can request a particular folder, and we'll send you that folder. You can't really request an individual file just loose. We can't really mail that because then anybody looking at it would be able to see the information maybe, and it's like too easy to get lost. But you can do a folder, so you need to know the name of each folder on the list so you could request a folder. We need to know the dates because that contributes to the inclusive dates of the records overall, and because that information is going to be germane to the team from Archives 2 that eventually is looking at it once it's been accessioned to our permanent collection. And finally, any mixed media materials, that's going to come up because we need to know what department at A2 is going to get custody of them. Over at Archives 2, where much of our permanent collection, but not all of it by any means, is housed, they have separate departments for different formats, you know, sound, video, paper, cartography, so on. So if there's anything in there that's not straight paper, we need to know, and that way we know which boxes have to be looked at by different teams, different people. So if you have a temporary record, a temporary transfer, box lists are not required, but they are recommended. You don't have to send it to us for a temporary transfer, but we recommend that you create one and keep it on your end so that if you ever need to request a file, it can be done more easily. You'll know which box the folder you need is in. You can request a particular folder instead of a whole box. That saves you money on shipping when you're referencing records. And, you know, it just helps keep things straight. So here's some examples of box lists on page, what is this, 26, 28? 28, I think. So this is an example box list. So you can see here all the essential information we talked about is on here. This one is folder level, as you can see. All the folders have a serial number. And then they also have a brief description of what's in the folder. Now, obviously, serial numbers are not required. Different agencies have different organization systems, and that's fine. So, for instance, over here on the second one, it says box 412. You can see that here it's just dates. There are no serial numbers like on the first one. That's really up to you. How you choose to organize your files is your business. The important thing is that it's folder level, that we have the useful description on there, and please note that both of these, in different ways, include the dates. This one says right up at top, the one on the left says up top, it's closed in November 1995, whereas the one on the right, it's more implicit. You kind of had to look at it and think, okay, what's the first one I see? It's January 1995. What's the last one I see? It's December 1995. So the inclusive dates are January through December 1995, or as we might express it on the front page, the SF-135, CY 1995. So those are two examples of box lists. Either one of these would be acceptable. Does anybody have any questions about box or inventory lists before we move on? Do we have any questions in the chat, Scott?
Nothing has come up so far, Brian.
Okay. So, ARCIS portal information, slide 24. So that means I misspoke on the previous one. It was 23, not 28. Similar. If you're interested in using the ARCIS portal, contact your records officer or account rep. Scott is an account rep, and there are 5 others, I believe. Each one is assigned a list of agencies that they cover, and that information is available on our website. And they can help you out with many different kinds of information. And one of them is helping put you in touch with training and resources to sign up and get started on the ARCIS customer portal. So our interfaces are different. If you look on the left-hand side of the packet, you can find 2 pages in there that show the difference. So you can see the print out the computer pages there. They look like this. I'll hold them up to the people at home. So these are the 2 pages I'm talking about. They may have been emailed to you, and if you're here in person, they're in your packet. So you can see the difference between the customer portal and the portal that I see when I log into ARCIS. This one that's a little bit larger on the page and has the web browser visible at the top is what I see. And then the other one that has less fields is what the customer sees. So that's useful to see how different our screens are. So sometimes when we're talking over the phone, it's a little bit difficult for us to communicate about the ARCIS interface because what we're looking at is so different. So, That's why it's important to know your terminology and vocabulary, and that way we can, talk about not the placement of where it is on the page, but what it is, So if you made a mistake, we can send a request back to initiated status. Yep, we can. Yeah. Like I said, the only one that will make us cancel it and start over is if there's a mistake with the security classification. That one we're probably going to cancel the transfer and start it over. Anything else we can change on our end. If you contact us, send us an email, even if it's at an advanced stage. There's also a status if within the agency they want to make changes. Is it, what is it? We have one clarification requested that we put it in if we want to talk to you about it. Like if it's submitted and then we notice that there's no end date on the that was put in, we'll put it in clarification requested and then contact you, say, hey, could you put an end date on there? And then there's another status that's internal to the agencies that you can put it in if you're going to, for instance, if your supervisor asks you, hey, you didn't finish this right. I forget what that status is called though. But anyway, the end game is to get it from submitted to approved. Maybe with clarification requested as an intermediate stage that we put it in. So that's how it works in the ARCIS customer portal. Once it's approved, you can print it off. It's got the transfer number on there. That's what you can put into the box, and that's what you can use to ship it in. ARCIS portal tips and tricks. There are character limits in ARCIS. The comments field does not print on the 135, and only the first 3 or 4 lines of the series description will print. Yeah, that's right. There's a comments field in ARCIS that's pretty big, and you can put any information that you want to draw our attention to in there. For instance, and we'll cover this later, if the records are under a litigation freeze, you can put it in the comments field. Different box dimensions, as we talked about, can go in the comments field. A number of different things can go in the comments field. Some people don't want their temporary records sent to Philadelphia. You could write stays at WNRC in the comments field. There's a number of different things you can put in there. But that's not going to print. When you print the SF-135 from the ARCIS portal, nothing in the comments field is going to show up. What will show up is the series description field, but only about 2 tweets. You can't put as much as you want in there. After a while, it cuts off because there's only so much room on the printed SF-135. So if there's something that absolutely needs to be on the printed 135, it's got to go in series description. Yeah, so use the appropriate fields. That's another important point. When we first started using the customer portal, a lot of people were putting the dates in the series description field. Don't do that. There's a separate field for that, start and end dates. That's just one example. If there's a particular specifically assigned field for sort of information, go ahead and use that. We'll have the series description open for info that doesn't fit elsewhere, and of course for the series description itself. We can search both PT number and CRN. Yeah, if you include a CRN in your transfer, if you email it in, or if you just like having CRNs, maybe if you have an internal agency tracking number. Some people who use the ARCIS customer portal still have a CRN assigned to every transfer, and that's because they have an internal tracking system that they want to be able to search their records by. And that's fine. Just put it in as a CRN. If you have a serial number, or if you just want to put the office name in there, like I suggested earlier, you can put Richmond 1, Richmond 2, Savannah 1, Savannah 2, whatever it is. You can put that as a CRN, and you can search by that. So it's just a place you can put, the CRN is a means by which you can put an additional search term on a transfer, because you can search in ARCIS by CRN. And it says we can do it, but so can you. If you put CRNs on your records, you can search by that in the customer portal. Okay, does anybody have any questions about the customer portal? Yeah, we got one here.
I've always wondered, when it comes to CRN, is there any list that we can request from our ARCIS account holders for CRNs that were created before ARCIS existed?
They didn't have them back then.
Okay.
So I can answer that question really easily. The question is there a way we can get a list of CRNs that were created before ARCIS? And my answer was there are no such CRNs, because the CRN was introduced as a concept in order to address one of the problems that ARCIS had when it first rolled out. So before that, it didn't exist. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, moving on. So on page 26 here, we're looking at the approval of the SF-135. Paper SF-135s are returned by email, otherwise to return address in block 5. So it says paper there, but that includes scanned SF-135s or edited PDFs that are emailed to us, as well as things that arrive in the physical mail or via fax. Those are sent to the email that's included in field 3. If there is none, then they're sent to the address in field 5. So that's how those are returned. They must be, an SF-135 must be approved by the Transfer and Disposition Department before the records are sent to WNRC. Yeah, that's right. It's got to be approved before you send them. If something arrives in one of our bays and the folks back there look it up and it turns out that it's still in submitted status, they will send that back. And then once it's approved, you have to ship it again. So it's important to wait. If you use the customer portal, you can check at any time and see if your transfers are approved yet. If you got one that's like more than a week or two old and you think, what's wrong with this, and it's not in clarification requested, send us an email, give us a call, we'll solve that problem with you. If it's not solvable right away, we'll at least put it in clarification requested and put something in the comments field so you know what's wrong with it. In most of the cases, it is resolvable if we got you on the phone, so go ahead and give us a call, and we can fix anything that's been submitted for a long time. Once it's been approved, you can print off 135s from the customer portal to include in the transfer. So finish up the packing. So you get that approved SF-135, either the one we email back to you, print it off, the one we mail to you, make a copy of it, or when you see that your transfer is approved in the ARCUS customer portal, you can go to the Reports Generated tab and generate an SF-135 and print that off. And then put a copy of it in the last box of the transfer. So if there's 8 boxes, put it in box 8. That's what we mean by last box. Then in the first box of the transfer, you put a copy of your box list. Like I said, even if it's a temporary transfer, we recommend the box list, and we also recommend that you put a copy of the box list in the first box. Now, it's not required. For temporary transfers, you don't have to make a box list, and therefore you don't have to put one in the first box. It's just recommended. For permanent transfers, both those things are required. You're required to make one, and you're required to put it in the first box. So then the other thing you do is label the boxes. Once you have the approved copy back, you're going to know what the official PT or transfer number is. It's going to be written in field 6A, B, and C of the 135. If you use the customer portal, as soon as you created the transfer, the official PT number was generated. That's the number that we need written on the box. There are special fields just to write it in. It's 3-digit spaces for the record group, 2 for the fiscal year. Even though it's 4 digits in ARCUS, you put 17 instead of 2017. And then 4 for the unique 4-digit number. So the whole transfer number goes right there on the box. Please use a black felt tip marker. Clearly print the information and ensure that all the information is visible. So do not tape over the transfer number is what that means. And put all the information on the front of the box. At least the transfer number is what we really need. And if there's anything else, put it on the front of the box. But you want to leave some space because we're going to put labels on there when we eventually shelve it, indicating what the shelf location is and so on. So here's what the front of the box looks like. You can see on the top right, there's a field for the box number. You put 1 or 50, 2 or 50, 3 or 50, X or 50, Y or 50. You want to have the total number on the right. Then over here in the top left is where you put the transfer number, 064170001, whatever it is. This is an actual physical hole that's represented there. And then finally, this is a section of the box that we prefer that you leave empty. Leave it blank because we put labels there. We also might put a label here beneath the box number. So if you had to write something on the front of the box, perhaps a CRN is a common thing to write on the front of the box. Perhaps something like, do not open, agency personnel open only. IRS has that on a lot of their boxes. Write that right here around this hole, or maybe in the bottom right corner. Open space for you guys. Once all that's done, you can ship the records to us. Delivery of the records needs to be within 90 days. That's within 90 days of approval, not within 90 days of when you first sent the records. You know, like we talked about how you know your stuff's approved. We either send it back to you, you can look it up in the customer portal. Then we have a pickup service available in the National Capital Region. You can email accession.pickup@nra.gov. You can also call area code 301-778-1550. That's the control unit. You can also use standard parcel shipping services, or you can hire a private carrier. Now, there's more rules for classified records and shipping them. There's different carriers that are cleared for different levels. That's worth talking to the vault too. You could call 301-778-1595 before you send classified and get the details from them. If I'm not mistaken, for TS, you have to use like a cleared courier. And then for secret and confidential, you can use different forms of certified mail. Yep, we have a question here.
Repeat the classified number again.
Sure. The question was to repeat the vault's phone number for questions about shipping classified materials, and the answer is area code 301-778-1595.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, the short version is that I believe for top secret, you have to use a courier with a clearance or a special truck service that is cleared. But then for lesser classifications, you can use, I think, FedEx or UPS or USPS, but it has to be the certified mail where you get it, you know, signed off on both ends and it's tracked. But don't take my word for it. Call them first and make sure that you have the details right. And then there's also rules about how you pack, sensitive materials before sending them. It has to be within a brown paper layer that's unlabeled, and then the label is underneath, like 2 layers. And there's other rules. It's worth talking to the vault before you do it. So that is how you send them in. And then once it gets here, it's going to end up getting shelved. Then at the moment, the vast majority of temporary unclassified records are being shipped directly to Philadelphia. There are a few record groups that are exempt from that. I think that's going to go on for another year at least. We're doing it to create some space in our building, give ourselves some time to do some transshipments and disposal to create space for the future. Anything permanent is kept here, anything classified is kept here, but temporary unclassified is mostly being sent to Philly. So if your stuff is approved and it's going to go to Philly, you can either send it to us and we'll send it to Philly, or you can send it to Philly directly if you see in the comments field that the records are going to be stored at Philly. Then finally, paper SF-135s, shelved is noted in section 4 is filled in, and then we email it back to you. So Argus users, again, once it gets moved into the shelved status, because it's your record, you'll be able to look it up and see, okay, it's received, shelving is in progress, okay, it's shelved. You're going to see all those status updates in real time. For those of you who are still sending in SF-135s the old way, we keep a separate copy of it from the reference copy, and that is eventually marked with the location of box 1, and then we fill in field 4 with that stamp I mentioned, and then we email it back to you. Or if you didn't give us an email, mail it to the address in field 5. And that is the end of the process for the initial processing of new transfers. So we're going to take a break here. Does anybody have any questions about initial processing before we take a break and talk about reference services? Do we have any questions in chat? Scott?
Brian, I'm seeing nothing on the board.
Okay, well, we're going to take a 15-minute break. I think. Okay, folks, let's get started again. So everybody could take a seat. Folks listening over the phone, we're about to get started again. All right, so who did not get a 2-sided replacement of the PowerPoint handout? You had one that was missing half pages, printed out the replacements. Take a look at yours, then you only have a 1-sided version, let me know. There might not be enough yet, so I think across the hall, get that. Okay, I need one of you two, and then one of these two. And then I'm going to come back with the rest later. Do you have a 2-sided version? Yeah. You got the Chair. I'm just more looking across the hall. You'll get him at the end of special presentation. So this is Ivan Johnson, and he's going to be talking about reference services. I'm sorry.
No, there's a certain area I'm supposed to be in.
Oh, it's better to be behind the table. Yeah, the camera's optimized for someone standing right there. And
I usually don't do behind the table.
yeah, it's only for the simulcast we have to do it. So do you want to use the clicker, or do you want me to advance that? Okay.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Ivan Johnson. I am the Reference Service Branch Chief, and let me stand behind the camera here. And today I'll be talking to you all about records retrieval. So the records retrieval process is basically what Brian was talking about with filling out the SF-135, getting your transfer approved, then you ship it to WNRC. Once it's here at WNRC, of course, you may need a file or box for whatever reason back to your office. At that point, you will have to do what we call a reference request. Now, reference request, your records officer will provide a list of individuals that are authorized to request records. Next, you have the ARCIS portal. Is there folks familiar with the ARCIS portal?
We talked about it
you did?
regarding the new transfers in the previous portion of the class.
Okay. Has anyone done a reference request? All right. What's your name, ma'am?
Rhonda McKnight.
Okay. How you doing, Ms. McKnight? And you have to?
I have a question, yeah. The list that you're saying individuals are authorized by the records officer?
Yes.
Is that a formalized form, or?
Yep, sure is. It's a formalized form. And what we do is once we get that list, we key it into ARES. We have a database here called ARES, the Authorized Requester Electronic Schedule. So that basically all that does is cover us to where if someone from, say, another agency or even someone within your agency that's not authorized to request that record can't request the record. No unauthorized access.
For AMS people, that would be me. I would provide your name. If your name's on the list, you can't get your stuff.
Yeah. Now, keep in mind from some folks who actually request records from other FRCs, we're the only ones that uses actual ARES database. If you request something from Philadelphia, you don't need to be on the list. Philadelphia or any other of the FRCs.
Hi, this is Scott from the seminar or webinar. Can we repeat the question? We're having difficulty hearing the audience questions coming up to the speaker.
Oh, it wasn't actually a question. It was just a statement of whether of who they can contact for their authorization. It was just a person in the crowd here. Sorry about this, guy.
Got it. No worries, sir. No worries.
All right. So there are a couple different ways that you can send in your request. Of course, you can do ARCIS portal, where you go into ARCIS yourself and key in actual request. You can send in and complete a OF11 form directly into us. You can email it in using student reference at nara.gov, mail it in to this address here, or fax it. Now, the paper requests, once they come in, we have to actually key it and enter in the ARCIS ourselves. There are three types of requests. You can, I'm going to skip around. The common one, most common, is just a temporary withdrawal, where they, just loan to the agency, and then it can be returned to WNRC. The next one is a permanent withdrawal. That's where you PW, what we call PW, a folder or box, and you don't plan on returning that file or box to WNRC. And then we also have review of records, and you can come here. What we'll do is we'll pull your files or boxes off the shelf, bring them down to our research room, and then you can set up an appointment with our research room to come review them on site here at WNRC. So the information you need to fill your request will be the full transfer number, box number, folder name and number, the type of request, name, agency, and phone number of the requester, and date and time needed for pickup or review, or mailing address if you're going to have it mailed out. Any questions on it? far as type of request or anything? Now, reference availability. Properly completed requests are available for pickup, review, or mailing within 1 business days. Basically, if you submit your request at 10 a.m. today, you will have it ready. We'll have it ready for your pickup by 10 a.m. tomorrow. 24-hour turnaround. Rush requests are filled within 4 hours. There is a fee for the rush request, so just keep that in mind. Another thing that you'd want to do is if you have an emergency, we consider rush request emergency. If you have an emergency request, it's probably better to only do emergency requests for pickups. If you do a mail out or something like that, it's going to come to you at the same time a regular non-emergency request will come to you because it's coming through snail mail. Unless you do, say, FedEx overnight or UPS next day air, something like that. So you just want to keep that in mind. Go ahead.
For records, there's just the Philly, your local area, are you still going to 24-hour turnaround?
Yes and no. The question was, for records that are shipped to Philly, are we still receiving a 24-hour turnaround? So the issue with that is, it depends. If you want to pick up of the request and you submit it through Philly, Philly will send it here, and then you can come here to pick it up. Or you can get it directly shipped from Philadelphia to your site. So depending on UPS and, how fast that works or whether or not it's going to be here within 24 hours.
But the 4-hour rush would not be available from Philly to DC.
No. Emergency requests would not be available. Any questions about that? All right, so other information about your records at WNRC, your agency's records are currently listed under the 01 summary report. The 01 report is distributed via email. The account reps usually email it out to the records officers, whoever your agency records officer is. And then your agency's records that are no longer listed at WNRC are on the 07 history report, which can also be given to you by your records officer via your account rep. So next we go into recycling records and disposition, but there is one other thing I want to talk to you guys about. With the if you're not a ARCIS portal user and you send in those OF11s, we do have something that is brand new that we call surcharges. So if you send us in an OF11 and we have to actually key that request in for you, we have to charge you a fee for us keying in that request. That's also something new. Yeah, that's about it. So, any other questions? Good. All right.
Okay.
Hi, this is Scott from the line, and we had a question in the earlier presentation related to ARCIS training videos. If you're having difficulty accessing online due to a bad internet connection, they're all web-based. So if you could get to a better connection, maybe from home or wherever, you could try there, because they're definitely just web-based. But we also do have hard copies available, and those copies can be ordered. You can actually just go right to the help desk, the ARCIS help desk. You can send an inquiry to the arcishelp@nara.gov, and just request hard copies of the ARCIS training videos, and then we can get them. You want to include your address, and then we can get those mailed out to you. So hopefully that helped out.
Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much, Ivan, for teaching us about records. Appreciate it. Just before I start the third portion of the presentation, does anybody still not have a two-sided replacement copy of the PowerPoint that needs one? All right. Anybody else? Everybody's got one with two sides now? Good. There you go. Okay, so, hold on, back. so if everybody would look on the left side of your packets or in what you were sent at home, we're going to do our first exercise to start off the disposal section. And that is the calculating disposal dates exercise. You'll be able to find it on the left side of your packet. I'm going to hold it up and show it to the folks at home in a minute here. It says computing disposal dates at the top. One sheet. Just about like that. Computing disposal dates. That'll be on the left side of your packet. Does anybody not have a copy? Okay. If everybody's got their copy out, we're going to go through the sheet together. There are rewards for participation. If you, unfortunately not so much for the people over the phone, but if you're here in person, you could be the proud owner of a pallet replica notepad. And all you have to do is get one of the answers right. All right. So if everybody's looking at the computing disposal dates, it starts off with a little bit of a refresher. Talks about the, well, that first part of the page there is just referring to the fact that fiscal years used to be calculated from July. And then in 1976, they switched to calculating them from October. But I think all these examples are from the last 10 years, so that's not going to come into play. That's kind of a fun fact. So you can see there that, I guess since 1976, you know, the disposal cycles are temporary, is every quarter, January, April, July, October. Permanent, just once a year, and that's in January. And so then we have a few computation examples there. So just looking at a few of the examples, we can see the first example there. You got the retention period from the record schedule, that's 10 years, right? Then you have the closure date of the records, right? FY 2012. The last day of FY 2012 is September 30th, 2012. So you add 10 years to that, you get September 30th, 2022. But then you have to go to the beginning of the next quarter, so that's October 1st, 2022. So that's the first example there. Then we can go with the last example, right? You have there permanent transfer to NARA 25 years after cutoff, right? So then you have example of 3 different dates, fiscal year 2005, calendar year 2005, and May 2005. And because it's permanent, it doesn't matter which of those it is. If it's in 2005 at all, the end date, then the disposal date is going to be January 1st, 2031. And the reason for that is because permanent records are only done once a year. So in each of those, it works out the same. If it's fiscal year 2005, the last day, the closing date is September 30th, 2005, right? Add 25 years, you have September 30th, 2030. Go to the next January 1st, it's January 1st, 2031. Calendar year 2005, the last day is December 31st, 2005. Add 25 years, you get December 31st, 2030. Go to the next January 1st, it's January 1st, 2031. In May 2005, the last day is May 31st, 2005. So add 25 years, you get May 31st, 2030. Go to the next January 1st, it's, or at May 30th rather, 2030. Go to the next January 1st, it's January 1st, 2031. So that's how permanent ones work. Okay, so now that we've had that little refresher, let's go through the exercises here. Do we have a volunteer to tell me the answer to the first one? 20 years, calendar year 2009 is the beginning and ending dates. Do we have a volunteer? Yes, in the back.
January of 2030?
January of 2030 is the submitted answer, and that is correct. You add 20 years to calendar year 2009, you get December 31st, 2029, and then you go to the next quarter, that's January 1st, 2030. All right. Do I have a volunteer to do the next one? 6 years, 3 months, fiscal year 2011. Right here in front.
January 1st, 2018.
All right, let's see here. We add 6 years and 3 months to September 30th, 2011, and we get December 31st of 2017. Then you go to the next quarter, and that's January 2018. So that's right. Next point. You want to do the next one? Yeah.
October 2020.
Sorry, what was that again?
October 2020.
Yep, October 2020 is correct. That's right. We had 10 years added to fiscal year 2010, makes September 30th, 2020. And then you go to the beginning of the next quarter, which is October 1st, 2020. No problem. Thank you. All right, so we got just a few more to go on the exercise here. Who wants to do number 4, 5 years from April 2014? In the back.
July 2019.
July 2019. Let's see here. April 30th, 2014, plus 5 years makes April 30th, 2019. Go to the beginning of the next quarter, and that is July 2019. That's right. Do you want to do the next one, ma'am? In the front, in blue?
Oh, sure. 20 years from calendar year 2011. 1/20/31.
1/20/31 is the submission. Let's see about that. We had 20 years to December 31st, 2011, and we get.
32.
Yeah. It's okay. You got it right in the end. January 1st, 2032 is correct. So that is calendar year 2011 plus 20 years makes December 31st, 2031. You go to the next January 1st, and that is January 2032, permanent. Remember to put that P in the disposal date field. All right, for the last one, do we have anybody over the phone line who wants to participate? 3 years, December 2011. Is anybody in there who's like not muted or wants to put the answer in chat? If you see the last exercise on the sheet there, 3 years from December 2011.
Well, I'm keeping my eyes open, Brian, but I'm not seeing anybody on the board yet.
All right, we'll give them like 10 seconds, and then I'll go to someone here. Anybody there?
We have Karina Donaldson has said January 2014.
Not quite right, I'm afraid, because you add 3 years to December 2011, and you get December 31st, 2014. So then the correct answer is January 1st, 2015. But a nice attempt, and thank you for participating. I would give you a little notepad palette if you were here. If you send your address, I guess we could mail it to you, but it might not be worth the stamp. But I will give them to the 2 people who were here who participated. Thanks to everyone who participated. And now you've had some practice in doing the disposal date. Thank you. And don't worry, we'll have another exercise later, so if you have your eye on the remaining little pallets, you know, one could be yours if you play your cards right. Okay, so moving on. Final disposition, destruction. Looking at page 38 of the presentation here, the PowerPoint. This is my current role. I'm a disposal specialist here at WNRC. My job is to review the records which have reached the end of their retention period and ensure that we don't accidentally destroy anything that's supposed to be permanent, anything that is of historical significance and has been misscheduled as a temporary DAU, or anything that is under a litigation freeze and is therefore granted a temporary exemption to the normal disposal process. Most records are temporary and eventually destroyed. I think above 80%, but less than 90% of the records we get here will eventually be destroyed. You know, and that's just because they're not of particular historical significance to anybody. You know, no one needs to see your timesheet, you know, beyond your next year's performance evaluation, you know. And so eventually that'll be destroyed. and so on for many other things. Many records here are working copies and not the original. Many records here are photocopies of forms or other documents. Many records here are simply only of interest for a brief period of time, long enough for auditing to take place, but not of permanent historical interest. So most of it ends up getting destroyed, and most of it ends up getting destroyed by being sent up to Philadelphia to be turned into pulp in a giant vat. Some of it that is particularly sensitive, either because it's classified or for other reasons, as we discussed earlier, is instead taken elsewhere to an undisclosed location to be burned. So that's where most of the records end up. However, and this is very important here in bold at the bottom of the page, records cannot be destroyed without the signed written concurrence of the agency. In ancient times, like the 90s, we would, I wasn't here yet, but I've heard tell that if you didn't respond to us when we kept contacting you regarding a given transfer that we wanted to destroy, we would eventually just do it anyway. But that is no longer the case, and we only destroy things with your signed written concurrence. What happens if you don't concur? Well, it stays on the shelf and you keep paying storage fees for it, is what happens. So since the billing is automatic, your agency will continue paying fees, even though they don't have to. It doesn't seem like much because storage fees here are, if it's unclassified, about $0.25 per box per month. But if you're systematically ignoring your disposal, that can add up pretty quick. So that's a few dollars a year per box. So if you're talking about like a 10-box transfer, if you were to ignore disposal on it for a few years, it would have been more cost-effective to destroy it after just a couple years. Doesn't take too long for keeping records longer than you need to be a losing proposition budget-wise. So it's better to keep up with these things. Nonetheless, if you fail to, we will not destroy them without your permission. Final disposition, destruction. The process begins 6 months before cycle. What do I mean by the cycle? I mean the disposal date. So October 1st, 2017 is the cycle that I'm working on right now. I'm also doing some stuff with July 2017. That stuff is being rounded up off the shelves and getting ready to be shipped out to the disposal facility. The October stuff, we're waiting to hear back from the agencies. The January 2018 stuff, I've started to look at. Starting to work the kinks out so it goes more smoothly when it comes. But the cycle that I'm working at most intensely with right now is October 2017. Agencies are notified when transfers are eligible for disposal. NA 1301s are sent to the agency at the beginning of the previous cycle. So, for instance, right now as we speak, I'm sending out October materials to agencies. About a week late. I'll be honest, that's par for the course around here with this thing. But I am currently sending NA 1301 forms pertaining to October 2017 transfers to agencies. Can I help you, sir?
How do you know when a series of boxes is coming to disposal? Is that all in the barcode system?
So we have a question here in the room. The question is, how do I know when a given transfer is eligible for disposal? Is that right, sir? We went through calculating the disposal dates, and that happens at the beginning of the process when it first is approved. That's part of the initial approval and submission process, is assigning it a disposal date. Once that disposal date's been assigned, in ARCUS is having that date, so then we can do searches for everything of a certain date where the freeze code field is blank and the disposition code field is temporary. And we'll get a database of all that, and that's the kind of raw material we use to generate the reports that we send to agencies. So you get these NA 1301 forms, and it just has the name of the transfer on there. It has some fine print about our responsibilities and your responsibilities vis-a-vis records disposal. And then the most important part, it has two big check mark fields on the bottom of the form, disposal approved or disposal not approved. And underneath that, there's a line where if the disposal is not approved, you can say why and give it a new disposal date. I think we'll go into that more on the next slide. So anyway, yep, we have a question here in the room.
Do other federal record centers send out these requests? Or
Yeah.
only here?
No, the process is now the same at all record centers. They used to have, they always sent out 1301 forms, but their process used to be slightly different from ours in some ways. but not anymore. Now it's all done on a national basis. Yes?
For AMS, that comes to me.
And do you filter it down to us?
Yes, I filter to you if there is something that needs to be approved.
Just because I have 25 years of this getting ready to, they should be start hitting.
So we had a question here in the room. It was whether other record centers around the country use the same process for disposal, and the answer is yes. They also generate reports using ARCIS and use that information to create NA 1301 forms that they send to the agencies. However, I only send out 1301 forms for the records that are here at WNRC. So if you had records at multiple record centers, most common perhaps would be to have temporary stuff at Philly and permanent stuff here. You know, you'd be getting reports from multiple people. In fact, if you had temporary and permanent stuff here and then temporary stuff at Philly, you might get 3 different reports from 3 different people. So that can happen. Does anybody else have any other questions before we move on? Yes, ma'am.
You have a large agency like the Department of Navy.
Sure.
Where do you send the NA 1301? Does it go to one place, or do you send it to the specific activities?
Navy is a poor example because even though they have the most different record groups, I actually send all that stuff to Maurice King. Yep. But there are other record groups that have multiple offices where I send the NA 1301s to separate offices. Health and Human Services is a notable example of that phenomenon. For those of you listening at home, the question was, for a large agency that might have multiple offices or even multiple record groups, do I send all the NA 1301 forms to the same person? And the answer is that depends on the agency. It's up to them. So the example given by the questioner was, what about the Navy? And in that particular case, I actually do send all those to the same person, even though they have about 10 different record groups. But there are other agencies, notably HHS, where I do send NA 1301s to different offices. If you want to change that, either to move to sending them to different locations or to consolidate them into one location, I believe the person to contact about that would be either your account rep or else Russell Loisel at Archives 2. If you contact me, I can contact those people for you. We want you to be satisfied with it, and it's ultimately up to you where I send them. I do believe, though, that I can only send them to people who are authorized to approve disposal. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Brian,
sure,
this is Scott. I can add on a little bit in there for you if you like.
Sure.
There is for the National Transfers and Disposition team, they maintain a centralized list of who is authorized, how an agency wants their distribution of their disposal notices to go out, whether it's centralized going just straight to the one point of contact at national headquarters, which typically is your federal records officer, or decentralized out to the regions. And then if we have it that way, then we have updated lists of the point of contact in the regions. Some federal agencies that have the multiple locations and multiple transfers, they're opting to work with us in more of a spreadsheet and email correspondence type letter where we the account manager collaborates with National Transfers and Dispositions and the Federal Records Officer to coordinate that effort as well.
That's an important point. There are a number of agencies that I don't send out the NA 1301s to anymore because they've collaborated with National T&D to set up this spreadsheet regime instead. So instead of doing that, what they get is one big spreadsheet containing all the transfers which are currently eligible, and then they can reply to that. However, just because they're all in the same spreadsheet doesn't mean you either have to approve them all or disapprove them all. You can you have kind of a line item veto where you can say, okay, I approve everything on the spreadsheet except for this, and this. Exactly. So who would the best person be to contact if they want to change that status, Scott?
Without a doubt, their account manager.
Okay. And again, that information, which account manager your agency has been assigned to, is available on our website.
And if you don't know or you're having difficulty finding out who your account manager is, the easiest way to do it is just send an email message to frc@nara.gov. That's our general mailbox. And it can just be as simple as, who is my account manager? And I can promise you, we'll be on your phone or your doorstep before you know it.
Yep. All right, thanks, Scott, for the additional information.
You bet.
Does anybody else have any other questions about disposal? There's still some more material to cover, but if anybody has any questions right now, we can address those. All right, let's move on. So we have here disposal processing again 6 months before cycle. I talked about that. Agencies are notified when transfers are eligible for disposal. So again, that's either in the form of potentially hundreds of NA1301 forms, each pertaining to one transfer, or it could be one big old spreadsheet. And we just talked about how you can set up, if you're sick of getting individual NA1301 forms, you want the spreadsheet, that can be arranged. Just talk to your account manager. Either way, the same mechanism is in effect. You decide which transfers you want to approve for disposal and which you want to hang on to. And if there's some that you do not approve, you need to tell us why, either by filling in a form provided for that purpose on the aforementioned spreadsheet, or on an NA1301 form, you check not approved, and then underneath there's a line saying reason for disapproval and new disposal date. So some of the most common reasons for disapproval are that the records are still being used on a regular basis for agency business. Another common one is that the records are subject to a litigation freeze, that there's pending litigation that the records would be necessary for, for discovery or evidence or whatever, right? Then another one is that you believe that the records have been misscheduled. For instance, you either think that they are permanent, you think that they are temporary but should have a longer disposition period, and that's one that I will contact you about. If I get a form back and it says that, I'm not just going to let it sit. I'll call you about that one. If you just say they're for current agency business, I'll just let that ride. I'll just change the disposal date and not talk to you about it. But if you say it's been misscheduled, I'm going to call you up or send you an email because I want to know, what do you mean by that? What do you think the new DAU should be and why? And then if I agree with your assessment, we can make those changes. And that would also involve moving the disposal date forward. All of them do. Even if you just need it for current business, you had to put a new disposal date. If you leave that field blank, I'll usually move it forward 1 year. And when you put a new disposal date, don't put just the next cycle, because as we said, we start 6 months in advance. So it's too late for it to be the next cycle, like 3 months later. It has to be at least 6 months later. But again, if you put 3 months, that's fine. It's just I'm actually going to put 6. So that's how that works. Oh, we moved it forward a little bit too much. Okay, NA1301 sent to agency at the beginning of the previous cycle. Like I said, I'm sending out October right now. Large volume of transfers will go into the spreadsheet. We talked about that. National T&D will send you a spreadsheet. Then eventually I will still process that spreadsheet after you return it to National T&D with your notes as to what's approved or disapproved and why. Finally, signed written concurrence will generate a pull list. So once I get the forms back, or once National T&D sends me the spreadsheet with your annotations on it, I go in and mark those transfers for which we have agency concurrence for disposal, and then that information is used to generate a pull list. The concurred transfers, those transfers for which we've received concurrence, are reviewed by me or by other disposal specialists here to make sure that the disposal authority is correct, matches the series description, making sure that the records are, given the correct security level, make sure that the records have in fact reached their disposal date, make sure that they are not under a freeze to the best of our knowledge, a litigation freeze, and if we concur that they are in fact ready for disposal, then eventually they will be used to create a pull list, which is used to actually pull them from the shelves, put them on pallets, and eventually put them on trucks to be sent to their final destination. Non-concurrence, continued retention submitted in writing. So this is the space on the bottom of the NA1301 form where you can put disposal not concurred. Again, you have to put why, and you have to choose a new disposal date. And again, that new disposal date is subject to review by me or by other persons. If you put it like crazily far in the future, I'm not going to do that. If you put it too close to the present, where it's a cycle that we've already started working on, I'm going to move it a little bit forward. If you leave it blank, I'm just going to move it forward 1 year. But usually 1 year, 5 years or less, and at least 1 year would be normal. 6 months is the minimum. So frozen records are not eligible for destruction. Litigation or pending audit. One transfer can have multiple freezes. It's true. Some transfers have dozens of freezes. And some of these freezes are pretty big. We used to have one called Tobacco Industry Litigation, or TIL, that covered like 30% of the records in the building, maybe more. and it was really a problem for us because it really hampered our ability to create space by disposing old records because so many of them are covered by the tobacco industry litigation. And so when that finally was released a few years ago, it really created a lot of opportunities for us to dispose of old records and create space. There are others that are pretty big. A lot of stuff in the Navy is under the asbestos freeze, or ABS, related to a class action lawsuit of people who have lung problems because they inhaled asbestos, allegedly. There was another one for Pigford. There's another big one for the Indian Trust litigation involving the Department of the Interior. And their alleged mishandling of Bureau of Indian Affairs records and files and so on. And so any famous litigation that you've heard of in the news involving the federal government probably has a freeze associated with it. There's a few dozen active freezes, and some agencies have no freezes at all. Others have every single one of their records under a freeze, and we never do disposal for them. And then most people are somewhere in between, where a significant minority of their records are frozen at any given time. Freezes come and freezes go. If you send in an NA-1301 marked not approved and you say the reason why is pending litigation, if it's just one, I'll probably just change the date. But if I notice that a lot of the stuff you're sending in is pending litigation, I'm going to ask you to maybe talk to Russell Loisel, and his contact information is on the slide. Russell Loisel, 301-837-3527, russell.loisel@nara.gov. He is the freeze meister. He creates and wraps up freezes for us, and he informs us about new freezes that have been created and what records they apply to. He maintains the database of freezes that the processors and the disposal specialists here use. And he's the person to contact about creating and or lifting a freeze or just having questions about freezes. All I can really tell you is whether one is on the transfer or not. I can't really tell you why or how long it's going to be the case. Russell might have more information in that regard. So that is freezes. And when you're creating a new transfer in the ARCIS portal, if you think a freeze applies right off the bat, please include that in the comments field or even in the series description field. Again, all of them are a 3-letter code. Some of the examples I gave are TIL, GMF, ABS, ITA. All those are examples. PAK is another, military sales. So that's freezes. Does anybody have any questions about that? Does anybody have any questions about freezes or about concurrence or non-concurrence over the phone line?
Hi, Brian. I got nothing on the board.
Okay, thanks, Scott. So moving on to permanent records, slide 41. So I mentioned at the beginning of the disposal section that like 90% or maybe more like 85% of the records that we have here are temporary and will ultimately be destroyed. The ones that are not temporary are permanent. Permanent records are those which have an enduring historical significance or interest, either for the government from our perspective of limiting or mitigating our legal liability, or from the general public because the materials are interesting from a historiographical standpoint, or for the general public because the records pertain to genealogy. So, for instance, we keep land sales from the 19th century, or land grants if you got your land through the Homestead Act for a long time, because that's often very useful for people researching their family history. We sometimes will keep otherwise insignificant records because they pertain to someone of great interest, like Elvis Presley's draft card, something like that might be set aside. And then there's other things. The bulk of permanent records are in there just because they provide insight into the functioning of key government agencies that might be useful either for historians or for litigation. So those are the various reasons that something can be permanent. Again, we decide when something is permanent right off the bat when you assign it a DAU, when you create the transfer in the first place. They're permanent right from the beginning. There are certain types of records that are going to be permanent. There are other things which are unscheduled or are archival sample, as they so called. Archival sample are records that are reviewed at the end of their retention period, and some of them are made permanent, others are destroyed. Unscheduled, we haven't decided yet whether they'll be temporary or permanent, and that'll be decided at some point before their disposition is effected. So those are the various types of permanent records. They're kept downstairs here because it's cooler, and they're better preserved down there. Most of the transfers here at the WNRC, including the permanent records that are still here within the Record Center program, are under NARA's physical custody, but the creating agency's legal custody. When permanent records reach the end of their retention period, they become accessioned, which means two things. One, they're physically moved to a different NARA facility, and two, they come under our agency's legal custody and not just our physical custody. The creating agency no longer owns them. They no longer determine who has access to view them, copy them. Those are now decisions that are made by us. And with different goals in mind, since at the end of the day, our agency is more public-facing than most other agencies, and the purpose of many permanent records is that they're available for research. Those are important changes in the status of permanent transfers at the moment of accessioning. Most permanent transfers are loaded into ERA, Electronic Records Archive, for agency approval. So that's what they do for accessioning, as opposed to the whole process I was laying out regarding the temporary records about either creating NA 1301 forms or creating a spreadsheet via national T&D that you receive and then respond to about what you're willing to destroy. With permanent transfers, the process is different. There's a program called Electronic Records Archive, or ERA, that I actually have never used. There are other people here who handle that, and it is within ERA that agencies are solicited for approval for accessioning. Similar process to that for disposal, where it doesn't happen without your consent. With one exception, I guess, GRS 26 Item 2A. I'll be honest, I don't know what the story is there. But I guess if something falls under that particular records series, all bets are off. I don't know. Records are only transferred within the electronic signature of both the agency and NARA. So again, it doesn't happen without your consent. For more information on the Electronic Records Archive, you can learn about that on our website, archives.gov/records-management/ERA. And for questions about it, you can email annual.move@nara.gov. The point of contact here at the National Records Center for questions or comments related to the permanent move is Tasha Bowles-Arnold, who we may meet on the tour. She is available at, what's her name? Do you know Tasha's extension? Is it 15? Well, I'll look it up and I'll give it to you in a minute. But she handles most of the permanent move here. Although I understand that I'm going to start doing more of it, so by the next time I do the class, I'll probably have more information on that subject. So here are some ways to contact us. So again, that first link on page 42 is that you can use that to find out who your agency's records officer is. They may have more contact with us than you have. They may know what to do. They may know what billing code you're supposed to use. They may know what DAU you're supposed to use for a given type of records. Another number on here, the next one is T&D. That's the general number for the whole department. So you can call that 778-1650 and ask for me if you want to talk about disposal. You can ask for Ebony if you want to talk about a new transfer. You can ask for Tasha if you want to talk about something that's permanent and it's going to be a session soon. You can ask for Kathy if you asked for one of us and you weren't happy with the answer we gave and you want to talk to our supervisor. You know, there's a number of different paths you can take. So if you have one number that you take away, I would take that one. You know, and you can ask for any of the people I just named. We all work in that section. Then there's reference services. That's if you want to reach Ivan or many other fine folks who work in the reference services section. So again, T&D, that's the beginning and the end of a records transfer's life cycle, when they first come and when they're eventually destroyed or sent away. Anything in the middle, when you want to withdraw something, that's reference services. So their general number is 778-1510. And then both of these large departments also have a group email that many people within the department have access to. So you can see that ours is suitland.transfer and references is suitland.reference. Suitland.transfer is also the address you can send SF-135s to. With NA 1301 forms, it's actually more common to just reply to the person who sent them to you. but if you do send them to suitland.transfer, we'll get them. So it's acceptable to send them there as well. Finally, the control section is 301-778-1550. The supervisor back there is named Andre Williams. The fellow who I think does most of the truck scheduling is Scott Johnson. The reason to contact them is because you want to take advantage of our truck or delivery or pickup services. They're the ones who manage the time schedule for the trucks. They're the ones who dispatch the trucks. And whether that's the most cost-effective option for you depends on a lot of factors, where you're located, how many boxes you need to have picked up or delivered, and so on. But give them a call and they'd be happy to talk to you about it. If you're going to deliver boxes to us as a new transfer, there's actually a number of different options. You can send them, as long as they're not classified, the sky is open. You can send them UPS, get that all the time. You can send them, just in the mail. You can send them FedEx. You can bring them yourself, as long as you have a government ID. You can load them in the car, drive over here. People have done it many times. Same thing with picking up requests. People come and pick up their own requests all the time. They also have them mailed through various parcel services. It's all good. The ball's in your court. If you want to ask about our services that are available, where we have one of our drivers who works here come out and pick up your stuff, either whether it's a request that you're done with and you want refiled, or a new transfer, give a call to the control section, talk about it. They'll be able to give you the next available date and quote you a price. Okay, so before we finish, don't get too excited, because there is one final little test and another opportunity to earn a notepad. So if you look on the left side of your folder or in the emailed attachment if you're at home, you can find this, record shipment and SF-135 exercise.
Ryan, we've had a request from the phone lines, and that is if they win the contest, that if we could show the pallet close to the screen, and that way they can snap a picture of it for their winning.
Yeah, for sure. Well, after I go through this, I'll hold one up, and anybody who had one can take a photo of it, for sure. Anyone who should have gotten one, I should say. All right, so go ahead and just raise your hand if you know the answer, or if you're at home, just put a message in chat, and Scott will tell me you got it. So let's go down the list here. Question number 1. Should your record center, and sometimes I'm going to change the language on here because it's a little bit archaic, I'm going to use the modern term. Should your record center boxes accompany the initial SF-135? Who knows the answer to that? All right, yep. The answer is no. You have to send in the SF-135. It goes through a whole approval process, and it's only once the transfer is approved and you have a copy of the SF-135 that indicates that the transfer is approved that you can send the boxes. So that's right. I'll bring them all up at the end, the little pallets, I mean. Question number 2. What are the 2 essential pieces of information needed in field 6F of the SF-135? Well, let's give this one to the people listening over the phone line. Does anybody want to chime in chat? 2A and 2B, we're looking for the 2 essential pieces of information needed in the series description of the SF-135.
Dun, 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 dun. Melanie Edwards has chimed in. Dates and series description, full name.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you want the series description in there, and again, you want that to be as close as possible to the way it's listed in the record schedule, so there's no confusion. Those being different is the kind of thing that can make us put a transfer and clarification request and then send you an email about it. And then the other thing that we need in there is the inclusive dates, especially the ending date, which we need to calculate the disposal date. So thank you very much, Melanie. Appreciate it. And I will hold up a pallet at the end right by the camera for you to take a photo. All right, so here in the room, who wants to take on questions 3A/3B? What are the 2 parts of each disposal authority? That's a little bit tough. Does anybody have an idea about that? Yep.
SF-115
Those are usually one or the other. Yeah, usually it's one or the other on those. What I was looking for was the record schedule or the record series and the item number. Oftentimes those are listed as separate. You'll have the manual number or the 115 number or the record schedule number that kind of can refer to several different sub-items, and then the particular item number, like item 3A. That's kind of a tough question, but that's all right. I'll give you a notepad anyhow. Thanks for participating. Number 4, how many disposal authorities can apply to a single transfer of records sent to WNRC? Just one, that's right. All right, that's good. So next up, question 5, we're going to give this to the people listening over the phone line. This is an important one. Can the SF-135 be approved if the restriction column, that's field 6G, is not filled in? So anybody, it's a yes or no, and just pop it in chat, and then.
Well, I've got 3, all at the same 4. My gosh, I think everybody's on. Everybody says no. Everybody's online.
The answer is a hard no.
Hard
that's
no.
right.
Everybody's capitalizing. There's exclamation points. There's all sorts of emojis. No.
That's good. Yeah, if it's a 135, we're not going to take it, and I think ARCIS actually just won't even let you. I think that it'll say we can't save that until it has something in there, if I'm not mistaken. All right, so moving on to question 6. How many transfers can be listed on SF-135? I know someone asked that question earlier. 1, that's right. All right, question number 7 here in the room. Do permanent series and unscheduled records require a complete content list, also known as an inventory list or box list, of files for each box to accompany the SF-135? That's a trick question, folks. No, it says permanent and unscheduled. It's a trick question because we don't require a file level box list. We require a folder level box list. So that's why it's a trick question. So that's a toughie, but the answer is a qualified no. We require a folder level box list for permanent and unscheduled records, not a file level box list. All right, so folks listening over the phone line, we want to take on question number 8. What 2 pieces of information must be on the outside of each box sent to WNRC? Do we have any contenders? Looking for 8A and 8B. What 2 pieces of information must be on the outside of each box sent to WNRC?
So I've been calling out the answers, but I've had myself on mute this whole time. I do apologize about that. So we have box number and transfer number.
That's right. The box number and the transfer number must be on each box. Also remember, please put them in the designated spaces on the standard size box. Or if you use a non-standard size box, put them in the same places. In other words, top left corner transfer number, top right corner box number. And express the box number as, X of Y, like 1 of 50, 2 of 50, 3 of 50. Use that format. So thank you very much. That's correct. All right, last 2 we're going to do here in the room. Question number 9. If containers other than the standard size record center box must be used, what must you do in advance? Yep.
Measure the box. Give the dimensions.
Yep, measure the box and give the dimensions. That's the correct answer. Yeah, and you can do that in field 5 or field 6F of the SF-135. If you're using the ARCIS customer portal, you can put that in comments or you can put it in the series description field. Remember that the comments field will not print. But you can put it in comments if you want, and we will choose a container type from the drop-down list when we process it. Okay, question number 10. What must be placed in the last box of each transfer sent to WNRC?
The
We've got online folks screaming out box lists.
Well, I'm afraid that those online folks are incorrect because the box list, some people here in person got it right, that in the last box of each transfer you put an approved copy of the SF-135.
SF-135.
Approved copy of the SF-135, that's right. In other words, an SF-135 that indicates that it is approved and has the correct transfer number on it. And then it's in the first box of each transfer that you put the box list. And once again, as a reminder, we require the box list for permanent and unscheduled, but for temporary, it is recommended. You don't have to send in a box list with the SF-135 if it's temporary. In most cases, we'll just throw that away or not print it. But if you attach it in ARCIS, or if you include a box list in the first box of a temporary transfer, that's recommended, and we appreciate that. That'll help you in the long run. Yes, ma'am.
I've had other FRCs tell me to put the SF-135 in the first box.
That's right, yeah. We used to do it that way. What changed is when we switched to ARCIS in 2009, the physical orientation of the shelf changed, so that now before, if I'm standing here looking at a shelf, it used to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so when that change happened, we switched it up to where the approved copy is in the last box, because that's more likely to be the first one I draw out as I enter it.
But other centers have not changed yet?
I'm
still getting, as recently as last month, getting instructions to put it in the first box.
Yeah, well, we do differ in a lot of small ways. Sometimes there's a good reason for it, and other times it's just inertia. And the big thing that differs us from other record centers around the country is size and reference activity. We're bigger, and we have much more reference activity. So sometimes a little small change like that makes a difference for us, doesn't make much of a difference for them.
I can comment just a moment on the box list thing. For the
Sure.
other record centers, yes, indeed, they do look to have the box list in the first box. That's just the way their warehouses are set up. It is different than WNRC, so WNRC does have that differentiator there.
And that's not the only way. We're different in some small little way. There's a few others.
What about putting a box list in every box?
We have a question here, and the question is, what about putting the box list in every box? Some people do that, and that can make reference easier. If you were to split up the box list and put, like, this, page 5 that pertains to box 5 is in box 5, page 6 is in box 6. Yeah, that can make reference activity easier. What I would recommend in that case is to just go ahead and make 2 copies of it and put a complete one in the first box, and then an incomplete one in each box.
Yeah.
That might be for the best, because that would serve both purposes. It would make it easier for people.
Is it necessary to do that?
No, that's not required. What we require for permanent or unscheduled transfers is a complete box list in the first box.
Okay.
And with the SF-135 when you send it in, and or attached in ARCIS.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions in here or over the line?
This is Scott. I can just comment from interaction with lots of different federal agencies. Putting a copy of the box list in the first box, good standard operating procedure. The other is definitely keep a copy for your own records. But then probably most important is get that box list attached to the transfer record in ARCIS, because then you'll always have it. It'll always
with the caveat that if it's classified, you can do that.
Of course.
But what you can do is email it to someone on the transfer or the disposal team here, and we will save a copy of the box list on our shared drive so that people can access it here if they need it. I don't mean the public. I mean other disposal specialists like me. But that's only in the case where you can't attach it in ARCIS because it's classified. If it's unclassified, it's better to attach it in ARCIS.
Exactly.
So does anybody have any other questions? Not even necessarily about box lists, but about any subject, because we've reached kind of the end of the presentation. Are there any questions at all on any subject, either here in the room or over the lines or chat? Okay. Well, if there are no further questions, then I want to bid a fond farewell to all the people who joined us over the simulcast webinar. Really appreciate you guys joining us. It's been good, and I hope I was able to provide some information for you. If you need to contact me, my email is brian.gonynor@nara.gov. You can also contact Scott, or you can call the T&D number that was on a previous slide and ask for me, or ask for the appropriate person, and we'll be happy to help you in any way. You can also send an email to suitland.transfer or suitland.reference@nara.gov. One more time, my email is brian.gonynor@nara.gov, and I'm a disposal specialist. So thanks again for everybody for joining us over the webinar. I appreciate having you.
So Brian, this is Scott. We're getting an awful lot of thank yous being sent out, but then also everybody wants to know where are the pallets. They want to see that pallet.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot that. Thank you for reminding me. All right, so this is what they look like. I'm going to hold one up to the camera. All right, so it's right next to the camera now, and I'm going to slowly pan back, and you can get a shot of whatever the appropriate distance is. You getting a good look at it?
That's very good.
Hold it still for a minute. You can take a photo if you want. Screen cap, there's a closer one. You can see the nice wooden pallet aspect to it. All right, then I got to hand out some here because I know some people participate. Who did I miss? Did I miss anybody?
Right here.
I did answer a question.
Does anybody else see me? All right. All right, thanks again to all the folks who joined us by the simulcast. I really appreciate it. So if that's all, I'm going to go ahead and end the call. Thanks for joining us. And if there's any more questions in the future, feel free to give me a call. Scott, are you still there?
Oops, sorry, I had to unmute. Thank you, Brian.
All right, great. Good to talk to you guys. Take care.